Vivian is going to start here in a few minutes, and she's going to have to ask you a question. So you need to be prepared to answer that question. I don't have a prize for it, but I'm sure you will be surprised with the question. So Vivian, I will turn this over to Paul to introduce Vivian, our program presenter for the day. Paul, it is all yours.
All right. Well, let me start by introducing a very capable person, Vivian Harte, and she's a former president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson and is currently the chair of the League's Speakers Bureau. Vivian has taught college classes in sociology and writing at Pima Community College and the University of Phoenix for over 14 years. She currently teaches online classes on assertiveness, self-confidence, and teamwork to students worldwide and coaches people on confidence and assertiveness. She is a co-author of Self-Esteem for Dummies in the Dummies book series. Vivian has a bachelor's degree in sociology from Indiana University and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Arizona. She's here today to talk with us about voter suppression and expansion.
George,
So
I am really thrilled to be here with everyone today. I'm going to do a screen share with a PowerPoint because it will make a lot more sense than me just talking. As you know, there's been a lot of activity lately having to do with voter suppression and expansion. And the voter suppression is based on what some people call the big lie that Trump lost the election.
This is your Democratic program.
It's 3 o'clock.
It's 3 o'clock.
Okay.
Time. That's right. It's time for the program. I am with the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. Thank you for inviting me, Green Valley Democrats. This is a great day in June. Hot. So the position of the League of Women Voters is that each citizen should have the right to vote. We protect the right of all citizens to vote, and we encourage all citizens to vote. And part of that is making voting easy, not hard. So we'll talk about that as we go through these slides. All right, so here's the question I wanted to ask. If you can unmute yourself, if somebody knows what this is, what this picture is.
Anybody got an answer for that one?
Anybody know?
I have an answer, but
I
let's.
don't know, is that Kent State?
Well, you're close. Kent State was a little while after that. This is before Kent State.
I don't remember the date of Kent State. Is it the 19?
That was about 69 or 70. So this is before then.
Selma.
This is in 1965.
Who said that? Say it again.
Selma.
Yes, Selma, Alabama.
All right, you win the prize. Thank you.
That was Helen.
This is in Selma, Alabama. So the Black people were marching in Alabama to go to Montgomery, Alabama, where their wonderful governor, George Wallace, was sitting as in the governor's mansion, and they wanted voting rights because Black people pretty much could not vote at that time. At that time, what was happening was they had to count, they had to guess at the number of marbles in a jar, or they had to say something about the Constitution. They had to answer a question about the US Constitution that nobody knows, you know, a little tiny phrase in the Constitution. Things like that, that only Black people had to answer in order to be able to vote or to register to vote. White people could just go in and sign up and register to vote. They didn't have to guess how many marbles were in the jar. And so this was a way to keep Black people from voting. So the Black people were marching across the bridge. They had to march across this bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, in order to get on the other side to go to Montgomery. On the other side of that bridge were state and county police ready to beat them up. And here they are beating them up. And this was called Bloody Sunday. What was happening at that time was people were watching the news, and they saw on Monday all this. They saw on the news on Monday that all this had happened. And people across the country were so appalled that about a week and a half later, the Voting Rights Act was introduced in Congress. A week and a half later. So the most important section of that Voting Rights Act was that here it is, being signed into law. There's Martin Luther King Jr. right here. And here's Rosa Parks right here. So they were watching as it was being signed into law by LBJ. So the most important part of that was Section 5, that required that if a state passed a new law about voting, that it had to go through the Department of Justice to make sure it didn't discriminate against Black people or any minority. And that was the law of the land until 2013, when the Supreme Court said, oh, we're just going to strike that part out because we know everything's changed since then and nobody's ever going to do voter suppression laws after that. Well, within 1 week of that being struck down in 2013, certain southern states were rewriting their laws to make it harder for minorities to vote. So not only was that not true, but it was also, it started a whole new trend of voter suppression laws since then. But that wasn't the only time we had voter suppression laws. In the mid 1800s, there were literacy tests and voter registration requirements for Catholic immigrants and the working class in New York City and Boston, specifically to make it harder for them and only them to vote. And then also secret ballots began to make it harder for people who couldn't read and write to vote. That was the majority of the country, by the way. So one of the ways that states have made it harder for people to vote is to have voter IDs. Now, most of us say, well, that's not a problem. We have to have voter ID to get on the plane. We have to have voter ID for lots of things, to drive our car, lots of things. But as you'll see, it's not quite as easy as you may think. So the history of voter ID is that in 1950, it was the very first state that ever required it, and that was South Carolina, but no photo was required. 20 years later, Hawaii was the next one. And then the next year, Texas followed suit. Then in 1977, Florida, 1980, Alaska. By the year 2000, 14 states had voter ID, and Georgia and Indiana had something called a strict voter ID requirement, which meant that if you went to the polls and you cast your vote and you didn't have exactly the kind of ID that they requested with a photo in it, you could have a provisional ballot, but you would have to go back to the clerk's office within a certain number of days to show your actual photo ID. Today, there are over 35 states that have a photo ID or an ID requirement. Now in Arizona, I'm going to tell you the way we are is you can have either one photo ID with your current address on it, or, and that can be a valid driver's license, a government ID, or a tribal ID with your photo. Or if you have a photo ID with an old address or a valid military ID or a US passport, then you can also add one of the following. If you don't have any of those, you have to have two of the following. 2 IDs without a photo, but with your name and a current address. And that can be a recent utility bill, a cell phone bill, a cable TV bill, a recent bank or credit union statement, a valid Arizona vehicle registration or vehicle insurance card. And what happens when people go to the polls now, if they don't have any ID, what poll workers can say, do you have that in your car? And everybody has, well, most people have that in their car, and they can go out and get those real easily. Property tax statement for their house, a voter card or a sample ballot showing their name and address, a Native American census card or a tribal ID without a photo, or a valid government ID without a photo. All those are allowed in Arizona. In some states, it's very, very strict that you have to have one of just a couple IDs, either a driver's license or a state ID. Or in some states, they'll say you can have like a gun license ID, but not a student ID, in order to make it so that people who have gun licenses can vote, but not students. So the reasons for voter ID is to reduce voter fraud. But how much voter fraud is there? There's almost no voter fraud. So let me tell you about some studies that have been done. In Kansas, a US district court found that between 1995 and 2013, that's 18 years, there were a total of 3 instances of non-citizens voting. In Texas, from 2002 to 2015, there were 85 prosecutions for voter fraud, but that's out of 42 million votes cast. In Wisconsin, there was a 2011 task force that found sufficient evidence to charge 20 people with fraudulent voting in 2008 out of 3 million votes cast. Most of these were felons who were ineligible to vote. And the Brennan Center for Justice looked at the United States and found out the incidence of voter fraud was 0.0003% to 0.0025%. 0.0025%. So they said it's actually more likely to be, you're likely to be struck by lightning than you are to impersonate another person at the polls. Now, it does happen in every election. There are people who vote for dead people. There are people who vote illegally. There are felons who vote who shouldn't vote. But it's such a small percentage, it really doesn't make a difference in the vote. So another reason for voter ID is to increase trust in our democracy. But what are the effects of a voter ID? There's a drop in minority voting. African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans all vote in lesser percentages. White turnout is the same, though. That's the important thing to understand. Voter ID laws are passed to keep white people voting and other people not, and also a drop in student voting. So what are the problems with getting a voter ID? Well, if people are working maybe 2 jobs, they don't have the time to go while the DMV or other agency is open. They may not have the money to buy a voter ID or a driver's license or a state ID. Also, maybe they don't have easy access to the relevant agencies. And in fact, one way that states have deliberately or counties have deliberately made it harder for people to get a voter ID is to move the relevant agencies out of minority neighborhoods, specifically to make it harder for them to get a voter ID. Some people don't have birth certificates. Some older Black people never had a birth certificate, people in their 90s or 100s. People who are born on the prairie sometimes don't have a birth certificate. Also, what happens if the county courthouse that you were born in the county you were born in burns down and they didn't have any backup materials? What if it burned down before the 1980s and all the birth certificates were burned? You don't have a birth certificate. But here are other ways to suppress or expand the vote. Early voting days, hours, and locations, voting on election day, mail-in ballots, drop boxes, and voter lists. So we're going to go through all of these right now. So what are the states doing to suppress the vote since the 2020 election? These are only since the 2020 election, since the state House of Representatives and Senates have been in office since then. So to limit early voting days or hours, Georgia, you'll see Georgia a lot on these. Georgia is really known now for doing more voter suppression than anybody, except Texas has a lot coming on, but they haven't passed it. These are the ones that have actually passed into law. Georgia and Iowa. Eliminate election day registration. Montana used to have it. Oh, but you can't do it anymore. You can only do it for a few days up until the election day. Reduce polling place locations or hours, Iowa and Montana. Ban snacks and water to voters waiting in line. Now, I know you've seen in the past reports, it was even here in Maricopa County a few years back. There are some states that deliberately make it harder for minorities to vote by making long lines, by having less machines in the polling places in minority areas and more machines in the white areas. So they have no lines or short lines in the white areas and very, very, very long lines in the minority areas, the precincts, those precincts. And so they ban snacks and water to voters waiting in line, hoping that they'll leave, hoping that if they're in line for 6 hours, that they're just going to leave and not vote. And it's something that isn't carrying
fair.
out, in my opinion. Okay, to tighten or impose voter ID requirements for in-person voting, Montana, Arkansas, and Wyoming did that. Shorten the window to apply for a mail-in ballot. Iowa, Alabama, Georgia, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kentucky, all of those states have made it so that the amount of time that you have to apply for a mail-in ballot is shorter than it was in the 2020 election. Shorten the deadline to deliver a mail-in ballot. So Arkansas made it so you have to deliver that mail-in ballot on the Friday before the election, not on the Monday before the election. So they cut off 3 days. So anything that arrives in the county recorder's office on Monday, those are all thrown out. Make it harder to remain on the mail-in ballot list in Arizona and in Florida. So in Arizona, what's happened is that if a person was on the permanent early voting list or is on the permanent early voting list, which is no longer permanent anymore now, within a 4-year period, if they don't vote in any election by mail, then they're thrown off the list. Now, one place, it was interesting. One place I read that it was 4 elections. And then another place I read 4 years, but I do believe actually it's 4 elections, a primary, general, a primary, a general. If you vote in person in those 4 elections, then you get thrown off. You do get a postcard in the mail or a letter in the mail saying that you'll be taken off if you don't reapply, but you only get one. You're only allowed one time that you get that in the mail. So, but that hasn't started yet. So right now, I think it's in the general election for federal. So that's why it's 4 years. I'm sorry. That I was reading about that. It was 4 years for the federal. So because federal elections are every 2 years, then it is 4 elections, but it's it covers a 4-year period of time, and it's not retroactive. So it's starting in the next federal election. Eliminate or limit sending mail-in ballot applications to voters who do not specifically request them. So these states actually did that in 2020, and their legislature said, no, you're not allowed to send applications to anybody for mail-in ballots unless they specifically request it on an individual basis. Georgia, Iowa, and Kansas. Eliminate or limit sending mail-in ballots to voters who do not specifically request them, not applications, but the ballots themselves. Florida has said that. You'll see Florida in here quite a bit too. Restrict assistance in returning a voter's mail-in ballot. Now, in Arizona, we can't do that even now. It's already restricted that only basically family members can take your ballot in for you. So these states have followed suit. Iowa, Montana, Arkansas, Kentucky, Florida, Kansas. Now that is before the Supreme Court right now, so we'll see what the Supreme Court has to say. The case for Arizona, actually. Limit the number, location, or availability of drop boxes for mail-in ballots. Iowa, Indiana, Florida, and Georgia. impose stricter signature requirements for mail-in ballots. Now in Arizona, what that means is if you send in your ballot and you didn't sign it, you have only until election day at 7:00 p.m. to go in and sign your ballot. It used to be you had 5 days afterwards, but now it's only on election day. So if your ballot arrives on election day, the election day people have to notify you and you have to get in before 7 p.m. or your ballot's thrown out. Now that's not true if your ballot, if the signature mismatches. If what they see on the ballot is looks different than what they have on file for you, then it's still the 5 days that you can go in and prove that you're who you are. Okay, and so Idaho and Kansas also have stricter signature requirements now. Tighten or impose voter ID requirements for mail-in ballots. Expand voter purges or risk faulty voter purges in all these states, Florida, Iowa, Kentucky, and Utah. But there's one more way to suppress voters' intentions, and that's by having legislative control. So this is what legislatures are saying, that they're going to have more control than the elections departments or even voters. Legislative seizure of election oversight, Kansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Montana. Legislative meddling in election minutia. So these are the little details having to do with elections that the legislature is saying they're going to meddle in these and they're going to have more say so than the elections department or even the Secretary of State. Kansas, Florida, Georgia, our state of Arizona, Arkansas, Indiana. Legislative meddling in, oh, there were so many states. I had to have two slides on this. Idaho, Texas, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Tennessee. They want to make sure that elections go in the way they want them to go into. Legislative imposition of criminal and other penalties for election decisions. So criminalizing actions of election workers and elections departments. Texas, North Dakota, Kansas, Indiana, Iowa, Arizona, and Arkansas. So there are some pending voter suppression bills in Arizona that I want to go over that have not yet passed or been signed by the governor. SB 1068 will shift significant election authority and oversight power from the Arizona Secretary of State and the Attorney General to the state legislature. Another way the legislature is trying to take control. It makes fraud determination partisan. That's the problem. The vote is pending on that. SB 1593 would shorten the early voting period and discard ballots not postmarked before the Thursday before the election. So that has been retained. So we'll see if that passes. SB 1713 would force Arizona voters to include personal information on their ballot envelopes, exposing them to unnecessary effort and identity risk, plus making it harder for recorders to process ballots. So the vote is pending on this. SB 1106, a voter must have the intent to remain in the state after the election. This is directed at students who currently have the choice of voting in state, where they're receiving their education at the U of A or Pima College, or their home state. This passed the Senate. It is stalled in the House at this time. But they are going back in session. They can still vote on this. HB 2830 is a striker bill where they strike everything and they put in what they want, would allow voter registration in all places that sell licenses, such as gun stores. So it is on the calendar for a vote. So what are the states doing to expand the vote since the 2020 election? Now you will see that there here and there are states that you saw before that are doing voter suppression, but mostly you'll see new states in these. These are laws that have passed since the 2020 election. So I wanted to bring this up again, ways to suppress the vote, expand the vote, having to do with early voting, voting on election day, drop boxes, mail-in ballots, and voter lists. So they have eased voter ID requirements in Indiana and North Dakota. Expanded early voting opportunity, Indiana, Massachusetts, Maryland, Virginia, New Jersey, Oklahoma. Protect polling place access so that people can go in easily. Maryland, New Mexico. Ease voter registration, so it's easier to register to vote. North Dakota, New York, Virginia. Expand drop-off access or locations. Maryland, Illinois, Virginia, and Kentucky. Miscellaneous ways to ease using mail-in ballots. Maryland, Indiana, North Dakota, Kentucky, Virginia. This can be anything from where you're putting them, how long you have to drop them off at the clerk's office, things like that. Provide greater access to voters with disabilities, Montana, Massachusetts, Indiana, North Dakota, Kentucky, Virginia. Restore voting rights to people with past convictions, New York and Washington State. Prohibit discrimination through State Voting Rights Act, Virginia. So it's important to vote. It's important for every single person who's a citizen to vote. And the League of Women Voters would like it to make it easier to vote, not harder to vote. So I'd like to close, before I take questions, I'd like to close with a song I wrote in 1984, but I updated it to 2020. And our election day on that day was November 3rd. So this is the way the song goes. And I am going to stop sharing so you can see me sing this song. And it goes like this. On November 3, be part of the team. It's time to come to the aid of America. On November 3, you need to be seen. It's time to come to the aid of America. Go to the polls and cast your vote. Time to have your say. Let your voice be heard now. We can make such a beautiful day. We can create such a beautiful way. On November 3, let's dream the dream. It's time to come to the aid of America. On November 3, be part of the team. It's time to come to the aid of America. We need your vote. We need it right now to help democracy. Vote for the people you like the best. You are the key to keep America free. On November 3, let's dream the dream. It's time to come to the aid of America. On November 3, you need to be seen. It's time to come to the aid. Come to the aid. Come to the aid of America. Thank you. Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
All right. All right.
Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions. Now, I do want to let you know, I don't know everything. So if there is a question I don't know the answer to, I will be happy to do some research and get back to George and let him know, and he can let everybody who's on the call know.
I have just a quick add to Vivian's point. In fact, I think we're going to record that song and sell it, aren't we? Isn't that the deal?
Yeah.
It's on my YouTube channel.
All
Download
right.
it.
Oh,
Just go to
YouTube.
Vivian Harte on YouTube. My name is spelled Vivian Harte. I have it in English. I have it in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, but I hired a lady to sing it for me. And so please go to Vivian Harte on YouTube and download that song and spread it to anyone you want. Please, please do.
Can we send it to Facebook?
Sure, put it on your Facebook page.
Okay.
Yes, please do. Any Twitter, on any social media at all.
We'll do that. Other thing I just wanted to add real quick, if anybody out there is questioning what their voter registration is, go to iwillvote.com and you can check it. You can check it at home on your computer. You can check it in your car on your or on your phone, anywhere you're at, and be safe wherever you're at. iwillvote.com. And it's real easy to do. If you're out with some friends and they are talking about voter registration, bring it up and you can check to make sure they're registered. Does anybody else have any questions? Please unmute yourself and turn on your video so we can see your lovely face in our recording.
Pat has one.
Yeah, I had lunch with Dean Buell, and she was talking about registering people to vote. And I suggested South Tucson. And the comment was that people in South Tucson tend to stay inside. Some of them don't even know their neighbors, that there's quite a bit of crime in South Tucson.
Let me tell you the experience of the League of Women Voters. First of all, I do want to give a shout out to Sue Gerardo. She's on this call, and she is the Green Valley unit leader for the League of Women Voters. So if you're interested in going to some very interesting, having some Zoom meeting, very interesting, informative Zoom meetings, contact Sue, because she's the one who puts them together, and she's great at what she does. So in 2018, we did not physically go out in 2020 because of COVID. But in 2018, we had a special project in South Tucson. What we did was we had these little cards, like the size of business cards, and they were laminated. On one side was how to register to vote in Pima County, all the different ways, go online and in person, all these different things. And on the other side was how to vote. Different ways to vote, not who to vote for, but different ways to vote, as far as going to the polls and vote by mail and early voting and all of those kinds of things, so that people knew what choices they had with voting. And our group, our Get Out the Vote group, deliberately went to South Tucson. The city of Tucson, South Tucson and Southern Tucson, to the neighborhoods in Southern Tucson, because that area has the lowest rate of people, registered people voting. They had a wonderful experience. What they did was they went to businesses, small businesses, and they handed out these cards to the managers and the owners and said, please give these cards to all your employees. And they were absolutely delighted to do so, because we have found, like, when league people go to certain places, it's better not to have us be the people doing it. Like in schools, it's much better to have the students in the government class register their fellow students than it is for us to have a table. Hardly anybody will come up to our table in high schools. But if the government student, classes, the students in the government classes go into classes, boy, students want to sign up right away. And in Arizona, they can sign up if they're 16 or over, and they're going to be 18 before the general election. So in this case, we found it worked much better going to the owners and the managers of these small businesses to hand out these cards. So they had no problem. They had no problem at all in South Tucson, and they handed out thousands of cards. So my suggestion would be disregard that and go anyway. Go anyway. That would be my suggestion. They were actually very, the Get Out the Vote people were very, very appreciated and asked to come back, actually.
We have several of the, I picked up about 1,000 from you guys, and they are great cards to hand out. Our voter outreach, anytime they go out in as a group for safety reasons, no matter where they're going. But when they're handing out these cards and they see wherever we're at, it's pretty safe. They see that we're actually trying to help neighborhoods to get out the votes. If you'd like to be a part of our voter outreach, put your name in the chat box or email me, and I will gladly add you to our voter outreach. Arlen is in charge of that. So go as a group.
I have a question for you, Vivian.
All right.
And you may not be able to answer this question. It might be more rhetorical. But why do you suppose there's such a rush to suppress votes right at this point? and such a, well, there isn't such a big rush to expand on voting that's more on suppressing. So what do you think?
It has to do, so at the League of Women Voters is nonpartisan. We do not endorse any particular party, and we do not endorse any particular candidate. However, we do observe, and we can tell you what we observe. What we observe is that it's almost all Republican states that have Republican legislatures that are passing these laws, and Republican governors that are signing these laws. And on occasion, they'll have a Democratic governor that vetoes the law, and the state legislature overrides the veto. So the reason why is because they want to make it harder for especially minorities to vote, because minorities vote more for Democrats. That's the long and short of it. And a lot of these voter things that they're doing, remember at the last election, it was a lot more Democrats who voted by mail. And if you'll remember in my PowerPoint, there were many, many more suppression activities around voting by mail than they were around in-person voting. Republicans more voted in person. So the suppression efforts are not in that direction as much as in mail-in ballots. And so, and you know, in our state, what percentage of people vote by mail in our state?
Probably more than
Yes,
half.
Lois,
Pretty high.
Lois,
Lois, unmute yourself. You have a question. Unmute yourself, Lois.
she's answering. It is over half. Lois, it's 80%. Between 75 and 80% of the people in our state vote by mail. And so that's why the legislature wants to make it a little harder to vote by mail, even though in our state it's about half and half. But because in the last election in many states, because of COVID, people, Republicans thought it was just fine to be around other people to vote. And that's why they would stand in line and be in person. Whereas Democrats thought it was more dangerous. And so they voted by mail. And so that's why you see a majority of the laws in voter suppression being against vote by mail, because they're really intended against minorities and Democrats. It's just a fact.
In a state like Pennsylvania, they allowed votes to be counted after election day. So is that being changed in Pennsylvania and places like that?
Right. That's exactly. That's right. Like the mail-in ballots in Arkansas it used to be you could mail them in and have them come in by Monday before the election, but now it's the Friday before election. So that is one of the ways that states are making it, they're limiting the amount of time that you get the ballots back. I see a question in the chat. What are the volunteer opportunities within the league? Well, there are two different kinds. One is outward, like this, like being in the Speakers Bureau, doing voter registration, outward kind of activities like that. We do lots of different kinds of voter registration activities. Even during the pandemic, we sent out lots of postcards, and then we did follow-up calls to women who were independent voters to encourage them to vote. Also, let me think. I have a whole PowerPoint on that. And then we have our inside things, which are like our newsletter. And also we have programs. We have voter education programs that we put on throughout the year. So we have a lot of activities that help educate the public, like the Speakers Bureau, and then also help voters vote. We do a lot of those. Our voter registration, by the way, is not just like out in public, walking the streets. We go to the big events like the book fair, and we also go to small events. We go to senior facilities. We go to mental health agencies. We go to schools. We go to when people become citizens, we go to naturalization ceremonies. So we are all over with voter registration. And get out, we have lots of get out the vote activities, lots of things like that.
I think Mike has a question.
Yes. First of all, we've been involved with the league for
forever. You guys do great work. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
My question is, Merrick Garland was on recently, I think just last night.
Yesterday. Mhm.
He was talking about strengthening and reinforcing voter laws and regulations and actions, but he wasn't too specific. Do you have
Right.
any sense as to what he's talking about?
Well,
What
he
he might
did
do?
he talked about going, using the laws that are on the books with the federal Justice Department, that you cannot discriminate against minorities. That was one big one. And also, you know, we have that audit going up, happening in Maricopa County. He said he's going to go after people who are going against federal laws having to do with how ballots are handled. So those are the two things he mentioned, but he did, you are right, he did not specifically say exactly which laws, what he's going to do. I know that the Justice Department did send a letter to Karen Fan, who is the leader of the Senate in Arizona, who's kind of in charge of the audit, what the Secretary of State calls the fraudit. And and raising concerns about how the ballots were being handled. Now, you know, the Secretary of State has said that Maricopa County is going to have to trash all of their equipment and buy new equipment. This is going to cost them millions of dollars. So, because they can't be certified again. The machinery can't be certified because these people have had the equipment in their possession and have done things with them. So they can't certify that they're truthful anymore. So this is going to cost Maricopa County a lot of money. To answer your question, no, he did not give specifics, and I don't know what those specifics are over and above what I just mentioned. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
You mentioned the percentage of voter fraud, which is like 0.000003 or 0.25. I mean, really low, like being struck by lightning, only less.
Less.
Has anybody ever done any studies if there is voter fraud, if there is, which is, there has to be somewhere out of
Mhm.
millions of votes.
In every election, there
Yeah.
are some.
Is it leaning more in one direction, or is it pretty much spread out evenly? I mean, I'm sure there's some Trump voters that were involved and maybe on the other side. So does
In the
anybody
last
know?
election, the ones I heard about were people who voted for dead family members, and they all voted for Trump. But in every election, to answer your question, that I don't know. I've never seen any study that says, because you don't know who those people voted for. We don't know who they voted for. Now, felons tend to vote Democratic. And so if they're felons, they tend to be Democratic. But I don't think there can be a study that can say which way it goes more, because we don't know who they voted for, and we can never know who they voted for. But I will tell you, when the League of Women Voters went to the recorder's office, and FN Rodriguez talked to us about this, and she said in Pima County, generally there's two groups of people who vote that shouldn't be voting. And it's very, 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 very small numbers. Number one are people who are felons who think they should vote and they can't, and they shouldn't be. And they'll do provisional ballots. And number two are older people who forgot that they voted by mail, and then they go to the polls and vote. So those are the two groups of people. And, you know, they don't go after those people. I mean, especially older people who, you know, have memory problems. I know people my age who do. So, you know, they don't take them to prison. They don't throw them in prison. These are people who think they can vote and they just can't. They're not really trying to be fraudulent. Now, if you vote for a dead person, like I read about the guy who voted for his dead wife after he killed her, and, you know, he voted for Trump because he said she would have voted for Trump. So those people now, they knowingly are doing it, and they know that they can't vote. But most people who, and those are the people that they would go after with a lawsuit, or be prosecuted, not a lawsuit, but prosecuted. So, but the numbers are so tiny, 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 tiny that basically they don't make a difference in elections. Certainly not in the election that we had in 2020.
So when we hear that about thousands and thousands and thousands of dead people voted and criminals voted, it's just an exaggeration.
Yeah, it's not
And
true.
It's not even
It's not
close.
true.
Okay.
Every election has a few people here and there, but
Yeah.
not enough to change the election. Now, Arizona has had 3 audits already, 3 legal, correct audits already. Georgia had 2 or 3 audits, but still they want to count the votes again. And what they're counting, they're not counting in rural areas. They want to count the votes only in the cities where there's minority voters. So it's really slanted, very slanted.
What surprised me, I noticed in your PowerPoint presentation that Kentucky was busy on both sides of the fence. They had quite a few voter
Yeah.
suppression and they
There's
had
some
quite
on
a few expansion. Yeah, Kentucky
Mhm.
was very busy.
Yeah, Kentucky was busy.
In Indiana,
Now, as you know, I didn't include Texas in there hardly at all because their big voter suppression bill hasn't passed because the Democrats walked out. But they're going to, the governor's going to call a special session, and I don't know how much authority the Democrats have then to walk out and not have it voted on. But there'll be a big one. That's another very, very big one. But you notice that Florida and Georgia were 2 big ones to the states that came up over and over and over again in the voter suppression bills that they've already passed. There are bills still in state legislatures around the country on both sides, but mainly voter suppression bills. Who was it? I heard a gentleman the other day who was being interviewed on one of the talk shows, and he said, right now, voter suppression is the beating heart of the Republican Party. And the League of Women Voters is against that. We are not for voter suppression. We are for voter expansion. We want to make it easy for people to vote, not harder, but easier. We want more people voting.
okay. So does anybody else have a question? Don't be shy.
Comment. About 10 years ago here in Green Valley, a couple was prosecuted for voting back home in the Midwest and again here in Green Valley. And so, you know, we're exceptional people here. And I can understand a rationale for that if they got one set of down ballot contests back in Indiana. Sorry about that, Becky. One set of down ballot in Indiana, and then another set of down ballot here in Arizona, that they could rationalize that they really do need to vote twice in order to have their voice heard, both back in the Midwest and here in Arizona.
Especially if they're snowbirds, that they travel back and forth. We have some league members actually who do that too. Not voting in 2 states, but going back and forth to 2 different leagues, and they have to choose which league they are actually a member of. They can't be a member of both. It's true, you cannot vote in 2 states, even if you're a snowbird and you only do the down ballot candidates, you cannot do that. You're only allowed to vote in 1 state. What you're saying, but it's still illegal.
Yeah. Yeah, these were Republicans, a Republican couple, and the newspaper identified them.
To stop this horrible trend, we have to have HR 1 pass on the federal level. The federal level would deal with all of these voters, more or less, all of these voter suppression bills. And then HR 4 is the John Lewis bill also that goes back and puts in the part on Section 5 in the Voting Rights Act. And so if those 2 would pass, it would deal with all of this voter suppression, almost all of the voter suppression bills. The Brennan Center for Justice is the one that I lean on, that I get a lot of information from. And they estimated that almost all the voter suppression bills would be considered illegal if HR 1 passes. So HR 1 is the most important bill having to do with voting. Now, I don't understand why they, well, I guess they would need the 51 votes, the 50 votes plus the vice president to even say that a voting bill is not going to be under a filibuster. So I guess as long as Kristen Sinema and who's the guy from West Virginia?
Mansion.
Manchin, Joe Manchin, as long as they're against using, not using the filibuster to get rid of the filibuster for voting, then I guess it won't happen. But I know that a lot of Democrats are getting frustrated about the situation as it is now. I understand that Joe Manchin is going to be working with Democrats to see if we can come upon a voting rights bill that he would agree with, and Kirsten Sinema too. If we can get them on board, maybe we can pass that without, maybe the Democrats can pass it without Republican input or votes. Why would Republicans be so much against that? Because they evidently don't want everyone voting. So the league is very strong. We want everyone voting, as many people as possible who are citizens. We're all for HR 1 and HR 4. We're all for them. Any other questions, comments? This is a very important thing, and hopefully things will be changing in the near future.
Anybody else have any more questions? Vivian, it was a great presentation. Every time I hear you speak, I always learn something. So thank you very much for your great input to our community.
Thank you.
In
Thank you.
Green
You're
Valley
most
and
welcome.
Tucson.
Pleased to be here.